Mentioned earlier, I'm going to be talking about open source. And my open source story starts in a city that I think most of us know and love. It's the Golden City on the Bay in San Francisco. It was after my first year at university as a computer science major. I had taken up a job at a startup company in San Francisco, and I was working there. I was completely fascinated by the romanticism of the area, the Silicon Valley engineers, the tech enthusiasm. I wanted to be in it all. So I headed out to San Francisco. I was 18 years old. I was very excited about everything. During my days, I'd go to work at my startup, and in the evenings, I'd come home and I would either go to a local tech meetup or just hang out at home. And it was during one of those evenings that I decided to take up a personal challenge. I was going to make my first open source contribution. Now, up at that point, I had never coded with a group of people before. I had never put any of my code on the web or in public before. And my opinion of open source was that it was the space for very hardcore engineers who were elite and superior, something that I felt I was not. But I took it upon myself as a personal challenge to submit one pull request to one open source project. So I went about doing just that. Prior to coming to San Francisco to work at the startup, I actually worked as a data scientist / machine learning research at a company in Chicago part-time. And so I had a lot of experience with data science and data science tools, especially data science tools in the Python ecosystem. And one of the tools that I used a lot was a tool or a library called Pandas. It's a data processing package that a lot of data scientists use to read and process and clean data. And I'd been using Pandas for a while, and I decided that I wanted to contribute to Pandas. So I did. This is my first ever open source pull request that I dug up. I went to the Pandas issue tracker on GitHub, and the Pandas community does a great job of labeling their issues, so you can find ones that A, take a low amount of time, and B, require a low amount of effort, kind of the low-hanging fruit. So I picked one of them up, and I worked on it. And saying I worked on it is probably taking away a lot of the story because it took me 3 days to submit this pull request, which was essentially a 2-character change. I didn't know how to clone a repository. I didn't know how to make a new branch in my local copy. I didn't know how to run the test suite. I didn't know how to submit a pull request. I had to learn all of it over the course of 3 days. But eventually I did it, and as you can see, my pull request was merged. I submitted a few more small fixes to the Pandas project here and there. And I didn't think they meant anything. They were just small spelling fixes, small type checks here and there. It wasn't a big deal. But it actually was, because those small pull requests were very well received by the maintainers of the Pandas project. And it was my first acquaintance with the fact that open source is the sum of many small parts. Even though I thought the pull requests that I was putting in were insignificant or minute, it was the sum of multiple pull requests that built up projects like Pandas, or the Linux kernel, or the Chromium browser. Now, at that point, I had submitted a few pull requests to Pandas, and I was really looking for more structure in my open source experience. I wanted to join a project where I could be mentored, where I could learn some more, and I found that in a little project called Jupyter. You can see the icon for the Jupyter project under the organizations list in my GitHub profile. It's right there, circled in a gray box. I got acquainted with the Jupyter project through a friend of a friend, actually. I had mentioned to my friend that I was interested in open source and that I had submitted a few pull requests and really liked it. He told me that he knew somebody who was familiar with the Jupyter team and that she would introduce me to them. And so she did, and we started a great conversation, and I eventually started contributing to the Jupyter project more regularly. And I think this this highlights one of the most important things about open source, and the fact that it's such a network and community-based effort, is that you're always one step away or 1 degree away from somebody who could help you do something great or help you find your next big thing. Open source is a community, and it's all about who you know and who you help and who you collaborate with, and those people have a lot of access. So I kind of had my doorway open to the Jupyter community, and I started contributing to a project, a sub-project within the Jupyter community called Temp and B. This was kind of a DevOps-related project. It was playing around with Docker a lot, and I had no clue what I was doing. I didn't know what Docker was. I had never done anything like this before. This was the first pull request that I submitted under the Jupyter organization. It took me, I think, about a week to get this pull request all ready and set up. But I did it anyway. And once I'd submitted my first pull request, I got acquainted with somebody who was the maintainer of the Temp and B sub-project at the time. His name was Kyle Kelly. That's his GitHub icon right above mine in the committers tab on the Temp and B project. Kyle and I's personalities fit together very well. Him and I were both a little rebellious. He was a little disorganized, and I was very organized, so we complemented each other very well. We had similar senses of humor. I found in him not just somebody who was a mentor and a senior engineer, but also a really good friend. We've known each other for about 3 years now, and our relationship is still pretty strong. And one thing I realized about open source is that everybody you collaborate with is a friend, and often your bestest friends are also your greatest mentors because they understand who you are, they understand your life story, they understand your goals and your mission. And I spent a large majority of my time at the Jupyter project contributing to the project. I was writing code, mostly in JavaScript. I was writing documentation. But really, one thing that I discovered really quickly, and my sort of claim to fame in the Jupyter community, was my ability to bring people together in physical spaces and get them inspired and get them working on something. So a lot of the work that I did in the Jupyter community was actually organizing events, like Jupyter Day Chicago, which I held in my hometown, that brought people together, got them collaborating, got them engaged with open source, and got them learning. So really, for me, it was about finding out what I was really good at, which was bringing people together in a physical space and getting them invigorated, and using that to push forward the community. So I did a lot of community work while I was involved in the Jupyter project. And I think bringing together people in a physical space is a really important part of open source. Open source is often viewed as this digital effort where everybody's on their computer and you're submitting pull requests and you're chatting on Slack or IRC, and you're maybe having Google Hangouts every now and then. But I think the reality is that open source is a space for innovation, and oftentimes innovation happens best when people are in person together. So I always think that physical spaces complement open source really well. So like I mentioned before, open source is a space for innovation. It's where a lot of new ideas get experimented on, tested, and refined. And sometimes innovation requires disagreement. Not everybody has the same perspective on what the best way to push something forward is. And this actually happened within the Jupyter ecosystem. There were some differences in opinion about the best technology solution to use for upgrades and changes to the project. And at this point in time, my friend and mentor, Kyle Kelly, had kind of created a new space for experimentation within the Jupyter community called Interact. And at this point in time, I wasn't well informed on the distinction between the two opinions that were at play in the Jupyter community. What I did know is that my best friend and mentor, Kyle, was starting this new project. And so I went and joined him. And I think this hints at a very important opinion and belief of mine, is that as important as it is to find this dream product or this dream company, it's also important to find your dream team of people. And Kyle is definitely on my dream team. He often jokes that if I was ever to start a company, he would come and work for me. But the reality is, if he ever started a company, I would come and work for him because he was part of my dream team. So I went and joined the Interact project. It was a new project, so I got to join the project when it was just fresh off the ground. I had the chance to help make a lot of key decisions and instill a lot of my values in the project. Working on Interact was some of the best time of my life. I had the chance to learn a ton of things from a technical perspective about reactive programming, user experience design. I had a ton of opportunities to learn about managing open source projects, whether it's how to get them funded or how to get branding and marketing set up for open source projects, or how you promote and do public relations for an open source project. It was an awesome time in my life. I was working with people that I respected and admired. I was getting the chance to teach people about open source and bring them into the community. I had the chance to help build something, and it was really awesome. And you might guess by the tone of my voice that things are about to take a turn for the worse. Now, at this point in time, I had been invited to an open source summit. It was a conference event where a couple of leaders in the open source community were coming together to share ideas and talk about how to make open source better. I had been invited to this summit as one of the maintainers of the Interact project. And I was really excited about this because at this point I was 20 years old. I hadn't been in open source for a long time, but in that brief moment, I had done a lot of work for the open source community. And here I felt like I was finally getting a chance to be recognized and respected by some of the senior members and more experienced members of the open source community. I had been asked to come and give a talk about how to improve inclusivity in open source and make open source projects more friendly for new contributors. So I said yes, I would give the presentation. I went to the summit. I was one of 2 or 3 technical women at the event. I got up in front of an audience of about 30 people to give my presentation. My presentation was a checklist of things that your open source project can do to be more inclusive. Things like create a code of conduct, things like make sure that there isn't any in-grouping or hierarchies in your open source project. And I would think I was about 2 points into my checklist when somebody in the audience interrupted me and took over the platform. He spent about 2 minutes explaining that he was a senior member of open source and that they already knew how to do this and that they didn't need anyone to explain to them how to make open source projects work and that I should just get to the point of my presentation. I don't think he realized the irony of the situation. That here I was, 20 years old, one of the few female contributors in the ecosystem, and I was being deplatformed and mansplained and publicly humiliated by a senior member of the community. I think that point might have gone over his head. It went up for about 2 minutes of just being publicly dressed down before somebody said something to him. And that moment really affected me, not just because of the instance of public humiliation, but because of some of the things that some people who I considered friends or allies said afterwards. That's just who he is. He doesn't mean to be mean. He's just like that. It really hurt. I had come to this event because I thought I had earned a seat at the table, and right as I was about to sit down, the seat got pulled right from underneath me. And to clarify, this wasn't the only incident that made me disenchanted with open source. It was the culmination of a lot of microaggressions that happened and issues and pull requests and sometimes in-person events that eventually resulted in a catastrophic explosion. I was devastated. I had centered so much of my life around open source. There were exams that I should have studied for that I didn't because I was busy working on pull requests. There were final projects that I could have done a better job on, but I was too busy doing issue triage. I sacrificed so much of my academics and my own career goals so that I could work on open source because I felt it was the space where I could find myself and fulfill my dreams. And in that moment, my dreams were crushed a little bit. I burned out tremendously because I had been working in open source for about 2 years at that point, but I had done more work in 2 years than most people do in 4 or 5. And all of that energy and work just burst inside me. And I just didn't know what to do. I had centered so much of my life around open source. I thought I was going to make it my career. I thought it was going to be my passion. I thought it was the rest of my life. And then I realized maybe there isn't a space for you here. People don't respect you, or some people don't respect you at a fundamental level. I had to figure out a way to get back up. And for me, the dream team came through. It was people like Kyle who helped support me and helped guide me back. And I'm slowly starting to contribute back to open source, although it's not nearly at the volume that I contributed at a couple months prior. It's really hard for me to get back on that horse, and I'm still working on it. But more importantly, I started to realize that I needed to embrace myself and my selfishness. Open source is a collaborative space. It's also a selfless space. It's all about doing things not necessarily because you want to do them, but because others might benefit from them. And there was a gotcha in this for somebody who, like me, is very sacrificial and selfless. I was willing to give up too much of myself for the greater whole. And when all was said and done, there wasn't enough given back. So I started to focus more on myself and make selfish decisions. I decided to start my own business where I could build a company that instilled my values on inclusivity, creativity, ethical software. And I'm slowly starting to get back into the vigor and love of technology in life that I had prior to that incident. Now, even though I've started to pursue entrepreneurship as the future and as something that I consider a big part of my career, I haven't left the things I learned in open source behind. In fact, a lot of the ways that I view how to build software, how to interact with people, how to solve problems are rooted in the experiences that I had in the open source community. The first is that it's best to be both a mentor and a mentee simultaneously. This is from my experience in the Interact project, where I was both helping launch the project and learning tons of new things about funding and new technologies like RxJS and Redux and React, but I was also teaching people and helping onboard new mentees into the project. So I think it's good to wear those hats simultaneously. It makes you a more empathetic person, and it reminds you to always be giving back. The other is that being inquisitive and collaborative will always get you results far more than being demanding will. If you walk into an issue with a request worded in a certain way, you will likely not get results if you are rude, if you're demanding, if you're inconsiderate of the people who are building the software project. But if you come into any situation with empathy and a collaborative mindset and an inquisitive nature, you're guaranteed to get a positive response from people. And I think that's generally true in any case. When you come to the conversation hoping to get the best for both individuals, you'll naturally get a better response. This was really important for me personally. If you can't find it, make it or be it. I've been the only X, Y, or Z in the room in a lot of different occasions because, as you can imagine, not many people who look like me contribute to open source. And I've had to become comfortable with that if I can't see what I need or can't find it, then it's best to just create it. And I think as engineers, designers, developers, we're kind of inclined to this mindset where we want to create things where there was nothing before. This lesson is also really important for me and I think very relevant in the startup tech ecosystem, which is that the process is just as important as the end result. I think as people, we have an infatuation with the positive end result of a lot of things, whether it's the app that makes somebody $1 million or the open source project with a ton of stars and downloads. Everybody's really excited about the end result, but not so much about the process and what it takes to get there. And one of the things that I learned about being an open source is falling in love with the process of the nature of opening an issue and having a technical discussion about how to implement something, breaking it down into multiple different issues, working together to execute a plan to resolve a problem. That process was really exciting for me. And this kind of interest in the process is something that I continue to be interested in. I mentioned that I started a company when I was building out the first product for the company, Zarf, which is a content marketplace. I actually started a podcast alongside that where I live broadcast the process of building the software and some of the struggles I experienced. And that was very intentional. I was trying to make sure that people knew as much about the trials and tribulations of bringing something to fruition as they did about the actual end results, whether they be positive or negative. And this is another point I think that the open source community still needs to work on, which is not just to share code, but to share knowledge. It's really easy to write a Python script or a Python package, push it to GitHub and leave it there. But to share the thinking, the process, and the ideas behind developing that project, the technical decisions and choices made, is a lot more difficult. And really, knowledge is where the power is. People who hold knowledge in the tech community tend to be the people who are perceived to have the most power. So if we can share more of our knowledge, we have a better chance of creating a more equal space in tech. And the last thing that I took from open source, from my journey to open source with all its highs and lows, actually comes from a quote or a rhyme that I read in an Arabic-English dictionary when I was 7 or 8 years old. And it goes something like this: little drops of water, tiny grains of sand, make up the mighty ocean and the pleasant land. And this quote reminds me that no matter how small our individual efforts can be or can seem to be, no matter how insignificant our work might seem in the scope of much larger events, the reality is that if we bond together, we can stand like great mountains or big crashing waves and solve any problems that come our way, whether they be social, political, economical, technical. Together, many small things can do great things.